London, 1888, the wealthiest city on earth. In Mayfair and Kensington, children attended school, wore clean clothes, and ate 3 meals a day. That world existed. It was real. This is not that story. Half a mile east, in Whitechapel and Spitalfields, a different city ran on different rules. Here, childhood was not a protected stage of life. It was a narrow window before hunger, labour, and the street replaced everything else. What you are about to see is AI reconstruction, built from census records, court documents, the street testimonies of journalist Henry Mayhew, and the photographic archive of Thomas Barnardo. Every child you see is composite. Every detail is documented. Tens of thousands of children were living and working on the streets of East London in 1888. This is what their days actually looked like. Before a child in Whitechapel ever set foot on the street had already entered the room. Victorian sanitary inspectors documented families of 6, 7, 8 people sharing a single room. Not a flat, not a floor. One room, with one window, one fireplace that burned when coal could be afforded, and walls that sweated with damp through every season. In the worst courts and alleys off Whitechapel Road, investigators recorded rooms where the floor was permanently wet, where the smell of open sewage came through the walls, and where the beds, if there were beds, were shared in rotation between family members working different hours. This was not the bottom of Victorian society. This was the middle of it. The street surrounding Spitalfields Market alone housed an estimated 28,000 people in conditions contemporaries described as the poorest of the poor. Common lodging houses sheltered over 8,000 destitute people per night in Whitechapel alone, men, women and children sharing wooden bunks for a few pence next to strangers. A child born into this environment did not experience poverty as crisis. They experienced it as normal. The damp was normal. The smell was normal. The cold was normal. Crisis was when the normal became worse. What was not normal, what contemporaries who entered these streets consistently recorded as shocking, was how young the working life began. In this room, in these conditions, a child's contribution to survival was not optional. It was expected. And by the time they were old enough to understand that expectation, most of them had already been meeting it for years. Henry Mayhew spent years walking the markets, alleys, and riverbanks of Victorian London interviewing the children he found working there. What he documented was not occasional child labour. It was an entire parallel economy, running beneath the visible city, staffed almost entirely by the young. The Watercress girls were among the youngest. Mayhew interviewed one aged 8 who had been working for 2 years. She rose before dawn, walked miles to Farringdon Market to buy her stock, then walked the streets selling until it was gone. Her earnings on a good day were a few pence. On a bad day, nothing. She told Mayhew she had forgotten how to play. At the Thames, mudlarks waded into the riverbank at low tide, children as young as 6, barefoot in the mud, searching for coal fragments, rope, iron and bones that could be sold by weight to marine dealers. Many had open sores on their feet from the broken glass and sewage embedded in the riverbed they walked daily. Costermonger families sent children into the markets as soon as they could carry a basket. Mayhew's records show boys of 7 and 8 weaving through crowds at Borough Market and Covent Garden, selling bootlaces, onions, and matches, their income not supplementary to the family, but critical to it. If they came home with nothing, the family ate nothing. Match sellers worked the theatre districts and railway stations into the late evening. Mayhew recorded children describing their working hours as beginning before sunrise and ending when the last theatre crowd dispersed. 14, 15, 16 hours. None of these children had made a choice. The economic logic of their households made the choice before they were old enough to question it. The street, however, was not the most dangerous place these children encountered. The most dangerous people found them there, and saw in them something far more valuable than a few pence worth of watercress. What the kidsmen saw in a street child was a perfect instrument, small enough to move undetected through a crowd, fast enough to be gone before a hand reached a pocket, young enough that courts, at least initially, treated them as reformable rather than criminal, and desperate enough that the offer of a warm room, food and protection required very little persuasion. Contemporary records document organised networks operating across London's East End and into St Giles and Seven Dials. Adult criminal receivers who recruited children from the streets, lodging houses and market corners, trained them to pick pockets, then fenced the stolen goods through pubs and chandlers' shops. These men were known as kidsmen. The children they trained were known simply as their boys. Isaac Solomon, a documented receiver of stolen goods operating in early Victorian London, is recorded in court and press accounts of the period and is widely considered one of the figures who influenced Charles Dickens's creation of Fagin. The fiction made the system famous. The system itself predated the fiction by decades. The technique was deliberate. Children were taught on a coat hung with bells to remove items without the bells sounding. They practiced on each other before working real crowds. Racecourses, street markets, public executions, and fairgrounds were the preferred locations. Large crowds, distracted attention, easy escape routes. Old Bailey records show children as young as 12 and 13 transported to penal colonies in Australia for stealing a handkerchief or a length of ribbon. 7 years, sometimes 14, on the other side of the world, for a theft worth a few shillings. The kidsmen who trained them faced the same court and walked away. The child who carried out the theft boarded a ship. That gap between who was trained and who was punished is documented in court record after court record throughout the Victorian period. It was not accidental, it was structural. For a family in Whitechapel who had exhausted every other option, the workhouse was not a choice, it was what remained. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 redesigned the workhouse system around a single deliberate principle: that conditions inside must be less comfortable than the life of the poorest independent labourer outside. Harshness was not a failure of the system. It was the system's stated purpose. Desperation, not relief, was the intended outcome. Entry required surrendering everything. Families sold or pawned what little they owned before presenting themselves at the workhouse gate. Coming through that gate was a public admission that you had failed to survive. In communities where survival itself was the measure of a person, that admission carried a weight that records consistently describe as devastating. What happened next was the detail that contemporaries found hardest to document without visible distress. At intake, families were separated. Men to one ward, women to another, boys to the boys' block, girls to the girls' block, infants to the nursery. A mother and child who walked through the gate holding hands were separated within minutes of arrival. The official policy permitted limited contact, a brief supervised visit at set intervals. In practice, many families spent months inside the same building without seeing each other. Children's days followed a fixed routine, approximately 3 hours of basic schooling. The remainder spent in labour, oakum picking, stone breaking, laundry, grinding corn by hand. The stated justification was training children for productive employment. Critics at the time and historians since have noted that the labour produced revenue for the institution and that the line between training and exploitation was rarely examined. For a child who had come from the street, the workhouse offered food and a roof. It also offered the experience of watching their family disappear behind a closed door on the first day, and not knowing when or whether that door would open again. Not every child who entered this world made it through it. Victorian public health records for the East End document infant mortality rates that contemporaries found difficult to publish without qualification. In the most densely overcrowded districts of Spitalfields and Whitechapel, medical officers recorded that significant numbers of infants did not reach their first birthday. Children who survived infancy faced a second gauntlet: cholera from contaminated water sources, typhoid from sewage that ran openly through court alleys, tuberculosis spread through the overcrowded rooms documented in Act 1, and rickets from the chronic malnutrition that came from a diet built almost entirely around bread, scraps, and whatever the street provided. Children already weakened by long working hours, inadequate sleep, and permanent exposure to cold and damp had almost no resistance when infection entered a room. And in rooms housing 8 people with one window that did not open, infection moved quickly. Paupers' burials were common enough to be routine. A child buried in an unmarked grave at parish expense, recorded in a register with a name, a date, and nothing else. Families did not always attend. Working hours did not always allow it. The register moved on to the next entry. What is documented, and what contemporaries consistently noted, was how quietly this happened. No public mourning, no disruption to the street outside. A space in the room that was filled within days by another family with nowhere else to go. The same city that produced the wealth of empire, the engineering of the railways, and the architecture of its great institutions, recorded these deaths in the same ledgers, in the same bureaucratic hand, without pause. They were counted. They were simply not considered. In the winter of 1866, a young medical student named Thomas Barnardo was taken by a boy named Jim Jarvis to the rooftops above Stepney. As Barnardo himself documented, what he found there were children sleeping in the open air, no shelter, no clothing adequate for the cold, no adult responsible for any of them. He counted 11 boys on a single roof. He went back the following night, and the night after that. Barnardo abandoned his medical career and opened a ragged school in the East End, then a home for destitute boys, then a network of homes that eventually extended across Britain. The promise displayed above the door of his first boys' home became the founding principle of his organisation. No destitute child ever turned away. By the time of his death in 1905, his homes had taken in over 60,000 children. Inside a Barnardo home, children received regular meals, basic education, and training in practical trades, carpentry, metalwork, and domestic service for girls. For children who had known only the street, the workhouse, or the kidsman's back room, the homes represented something genuinely different. What they also represented was control. Barnardo made decisions about children's futures that no one consulted the children about. He changed names. He separated siblings. And beginning in the 1880s, he oversaw a program of child emigration that sent tens of thousands of children to Canada, Australia, and other parts of the empire, removed permanently from their country, their families, and any chance of reunion. For some children, emigration meant farmland, space, and a life that London could never have offered. For others, it meant unpaid labour, isolation, and displacement from which there was no return. Barnardo looked at the same streets every other Victorian institution had looked at and chose to act. What that action meant depended entirely on which child you were and which door you walked through. Go back to where this started. London, 1888, the wealthiest city on earth. And inside it, tens of thousands of children waking before dawn to carry baskets, wade through river mud, pick pockets under instruction, watch their families disappear behind workhouse doors, and bury siblings in graves that had no stone. The question Victorian society asked about these children was whether they were deserving, whether their poverty was the result of personal failure or moral weakness, whether the child who stole a handkerchief was a criminal or a casualty. Those debates filled newspapers, parliamentary reports, and church sermons for the entire second half of the 19th century. They are not unfamiliar debates. The structures have changed. The language has changed. The question of who is considered deserving of protection and who is considered responsible for their own condition has not gone anywhere. What the documented history of these children forces is something simpler than a political argument. It forces a choice. If you had been born into that single room in Whitechapel, not visiting it, not studying it, but born into it, with no other reference point, what would you have done differently? If your child had not eaten in 2 days and a man offered them work that crossed a line, where exactly would you have drawn that line? These children did not fail Victorian London. Victorian London failed them. The records are unambiguous on that point, even when the people writing the records were not. They deserved better than they got. The least history can do is make sure they are remembered accurately. If this video made you see the Victorian era differently, subscribe. This channel exists for one reason: to find the real story underneath the story history usually tells. Do not miss what we cover next.